if we could just begin this session. I'm not entirely sure what the title is now, but it's on Expressions of Contemporary China, I think is what it's titled. Let me start off. My name is Shahid Zahid, and I will be moderating the session and be in conversation with Miss Melisssa Chiu. Let me give a very brief introduction about Melisssa. Melisssa Chiu is an Australian-born citizen of Chinese origin. She is at present the head of the Hirshhorn Museum of Contemporary Art, which is one of the Smithsonian institutions in Washington, D.C. She has the rare distinction of being the first non-American to be appointed as the head of the Hirshhorn. Melisssa has a long and distinguished career, despite her very young age, both as a curator and a museum director. She was born in Australia in Darwin. She studied at the University of Western Sydney and at the University of New South Wales. She did a bachelor's, a master's, and then a PhD, specializing in contemporary Asian art, and her PhD thesis, if I'm not mistaken, was on the subject of the art of the Chinese diaspora, contemporary art of the Chinese diaspora. She spent several years as a curator, working privately as a curator, and then she was appointed to the University of Western Sydney's museum collection as the head of that collection. She spent a few years there in the mid-90s, 1990s. She then set up her own collective and museum and Center for Contemporary Asian Art in Australia. In 2004, she was appointed as the director of the museum director of the Asia Society in New York City, and she had a long and distinguished career there. She did several very major exhibitions. She basically turned a lot of the work that they were doing on Asian art at the Asia Society around. She was also involved in a very major exhibition of contemporary Pakistani art called Hanging Fire, which was done in collaboration with several of our art curators and luminaries from here, including Salima Hashmi. In 2014, Melisssa was appointed as the head of the Hirshhorn Museum of Contemporary Art in Washington, D.C., and that was a very big change for the Hirshhorn. Like I said, the first non-American ever to head at the Hirshhorn Museum, which, if you are not familiar with it, is possibly one of the leading, is perhaps amongst the 3 or 4 leading contemporary art spaces in North America. And under Melissa's able leadership, it, I believe last year became the 3rd most visited contemporary art museum in America, 3rd only to the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney School of American Art. Melisssa has been working there now for 3 years, a little over 3 years. She's had some major exhibitions there. Last year she did a terrific show of a Japanese artist called Yayoi Kusama, called Infinity Mirrors, which set records for attendance for the Hirshhorn Museum. I'd like to pass it over to Melisssa now. She's going to make a short presentation, show you some slides, giving you an idea of how contemporary art in Asia, in China, has evolved in the last 20 or 30 years, and then we will have a conversation on contemporary Chinese art, Asian art, and more generally about art in the region. Thank you, Melisssa.
Thank you, Shahid. Thank you for that very generous introduction, actually. It's a pleasure to be here in the hall. I've been here a number of times, but it's a real delight to be back and to be talking about Chinese contemporary art. It was interesting in one of the other sessions that China was mentioned. And, you know, it is true that China is certainly growing in political and economic importance. And I think one of the things that really interested me in my student days was to understand what was going on in China in the early 1990s when I started out at university. I was very interested in what was actually happening in China. And at that moment in time, there were only really 2 books on the subject of Chinese contemporary art. Both were exhibition catalogues done in 1993, one at the House of World Cultures in Berlin, and the other produced in Hong Kong. And they were exhibitions that were done in response to Tiananmen, what happened on June 4th, 1989, that incident. And so they were looking at art that was a response to. I thought I would spend a little bit of the first minutes of my talk today providing a context for what we think we know about Chinese contemporary art, and knowing that perhaps there have been a few exhibitions of Chinese contemporary art here in this country, I thought I'd share with you some images, because as of yet, there really isn't one single place that you can go to see a great collection of Chinese contemporary art. There have been some efforts made in Hong Kong and various other museums, but really no place, not even in China, where you can get access to that sense of history of the last 40 years. So I'm going to share with you some images and a little bit of the art historian in me in a kind of chronology to walk you through some of the developments over the last 40 years in very succinct fashion and by no means comprehensive. But what I wanted to do was to set a little bit of a tone for the understanding of what's happening in China today. You know, when we think of China, we think of great cultural traditions, that of 5,000 years of real culture. But in fact, most of the artists working, living today, especially that of a mid-career artist, were greatly impacted by the Cultural Revolution. This is an image by Teng Xiaohe, one of the iconic works from this period, which was 10 years, 1966 to 1976, when there was a nationwide attempt on the part of Mao Zedong to wipe away all the old traditions. And they did that remarkably through trying to reassert a new kind of cultural tradition that was politically minded, led by Madame Mao, Jiang Qing as she was known. She determined that all paintings in China during this 10-year period had to have 3 qualities, being red, roughly translated as red, bright and shining. They had to show the very best of this Maoist kind of revolutionary spirit. So you always see Mao in these kinds of poses. Now, this was the 60s and 70s, and obviously we're in a very different place today. But for those artists who are in their mid-career right now, these were the images that really set their whole visual vocabulary. When we talk about Chinese contemporary art, we talk about the birth as being 1979, with an important exhibition opposite the National Gallery of Art, and it was a group of artists, mostly untrained, who decided to show their work on the fence of a park opposite the National Gallery. And so this group was called the Stars Group, or in Chinese Xingxing, and it attracted a lot of attention. There were mostly paintings and sculptures, and the real break for these artists was that they weren't painting Mao or any political figures. This was completely self-directed. It may look rather the works may look rather conservative to us today, in that it was landscapes and figures and things like that. But for those artists, that younger generation of artists in 1979, it was a strong declaration, a move away from political art. One of the artists who participated in the Stars movement in 1979 was this artist, Wang Keping. He was one of the few sculptors, but I think that in some ways this was one of the few works that was created at this time that was critical of Mao's policies. And you can see that criticism ever so slightly in the one eye half closed and one eye open. And we think of that as, you would never have been able to do this during the Cultural Revolution, because it signals that, there was one eye half closed, one eye half closed towards what was actually really going on during that period. Geng Jianyi, in some ways the precursor to the early 1990s movement, and this was the first time that Chinese contemporary art became international through the political pop artists, and this is considered one of the precursors to that work that often featured self-portraits and using the artist's own face for self-expression. This is by Wang Guangyi, an important work because it refers back to his youth, when during the Cultural Revolution his generation of artists were taught to paint through learning to paint portraits of Mao, and the most common way of allowing a faithful rendering of that portrait of Mao, and only the best artists were allowed to paint Mao's portrait, was to divide up the picture into a grid. And so the artist would then copy the small grids that would then make up the whole, and it's a much easier way of teaching the faithful kind of copying of an image. This was the beginning in some ways of the political pop movement that became very well known internationally. This is by Zhang Shaogang, who created this Bloodline series. And you'll see the reference, the harkening back again to the Cultural Revolution. This is a portrait, a family portrait, obviously pre the one-child policy, so it was taken much earlier. During the Cultural Revolution, you can see that through the boy in the center has a young pioneer's tie, this red tie. But you'll also see, if you look very closely, this idea of a bloodline. So you'll see this red here, bloodline linking each of the figures. And when you think of Chinese traditions and ancestor worship, it was always about one's ancestors. But what happened during the Cultural Revolution was a severing of those ties and traditions. And in place of that was this allegiance, in a way, to Mao and to the politics of the period. What also happened in the 1990s with a growing international recognition of Chinese contemporary artists was newfound interest in installation art, and this is one of the few women who were working during this time in Tianyao. There were a group of women, very few of them know. Artists working in the mid-1990s and interested in installation art, and she created a practice of thread winding. So each of these balls are wound thread, of which she did hundreds of them. Another female artist, Yin Shojun, who was also doing installation art, and I think that during this period, especially after 1989 and in the post-Tiananmen period, it was virtually impossible for these artists to show this kind of work. There was no gallery system in place. The public museums did not think of this as art. And so the only places they could really show their work were either in their own studios or overseas. And so you see a whole movement develop around what we called apartment art. So it was art that was only done for the privacy of the artist's studio or home. This is highball. Photography became more widely used in the late 1990s, and so you'll see here the artist going back to history, back to his own personal history. So he found photographs and then went back to the subjects and rephotographed them many decades later. And performance art in a place called Beijing's East Village. Actually, it was interesting. Ai Weiwei came back from New York with tales of New York's East Village and the kind of protests that he witnessed firsthand there. And he inspired a whole new generation of younger artists to do performance art and to do other kinds of activities. And so it was Zhang Huan who started to do performance art and then also used photography to document his performance. And here we have the family tree, which begins with calligraphy on the artist's face that continues throughout the day until his entire face disappears under the weight of that calligraphic history. And I think, most people when they think of Chinese contemporary art, they think of Ai Weiwei, certainly because of his international reputation. He had spent some time in New York and then returned to Beijing around 1994. I mentioned that he had inspired a younger generation to do radical performance art, amongst other things. But it was really in 2008, around the time of the Beijing Olympics, that he came out very publicly to criticize the Chinese government and gained even more international attention. It was, however, his work of documenting the many children who were killed during the Sichuan earthquake, just by noting down their names. It was something of a conceptual project, and it was from this time and the injuries from an act of police brutality that really gave him even more international attention. And as some of you know, he was imprisoned for a number of months and his passport confiscated, and now he lives fairly most of his time in Berlin, outside of the country. And I thought I would finish my brief kind of summary with an image of one of the new museums in China, because for so long Chinese contemporary art was shown outside of the country because of restrictions after June 4th, 1989. And what has happened today is a whole burgeoning of new gallery complexes, such as 798 in Beijing, or new museums, such as this one called the Long Museum, which is an entirely privately supported museum with a collection, a contemporary art collection and a historical collection of antiquities. And it shows that there is much change going on in China, and in fact this history that I just outlined is now being written. When I started, there were no historical accounts or records, but now we have many books being written and the art history being told in China, which is a whole new phenomenon.
Thank you, Melissa. I have a few remarks and questions, but we will not make it a question and answer session, and we just
Sure.
make it more like a conversation. You mentioned the Cultural Revolution period and how there was this movement to do away with all the old traditional cultures and traditions in China and to replace it with this new form of socialist art, and art with a very particular political message. And then later, when the Cultural Revolution was over, a lot of the art you showed us, and the artists, what they seemed to be doing was going back to those old traditions and cultures, and the calligraphy, the family trees, even references, the political references to the one-child policy and so on. They were basically going back to various traditions, Chinese traditions and culture, and expressing that through their art now, and combining the two, so doing away with those 10 or so years of the Cultural Revolution, and creating a new form of art, which then became the contemporary art that we see today. We ourselves here in South Asia come from a very long tradition of culture and history and art as well. And we find similar things happening over here, where a lot of the contemporary art is rooted in our traditions and cultures. Miniature painting, for example, is very traditional, using traditional techniques, but the messages are big, and they're political, and they're very modern, and they deal with feminism, they deal with sexuality, they deal with political messaging and various kinds of dissent. So do you see this sort of movement everywhere in contemporary Asian art, or is it just something you see in these very old traditional cultures? What's your take on that?
No, I mean, I think it's an important point. One of the real differences, I think, with China as a country culturally is that it had this break with tradition. In a way, I hesitate to say, but I think in a way on a scale that no other countries experienced. This was really a concerted campaign to destroy old traditions, destroy temples, destroy artifacts, antiquities, and that kind of violence I haven't seen happen anywhere else in the world, at least on the scale with which we saw in China. When some years ago I wrote a book that was something of an introduction to Asian contemporary art, and I wrote that one of the important features of thinking about contemporary art in this part of the world, in Asia, is that there is a long tradition. And one of the differences I see between the contemporary art scene here in this region and other places is a strong engagement with tradition. In fact, in some cases, there are parallel art worlds, one of which sometimes in different countries each is its own, that addresses tradition in a more as a continuation of tradition. And then you have another art world that is much more engaged in that international idea of updating tradition. And those that, for example, if you think of here in Pakistan, the miniature tradition, there are a whole group of artists who have updated that tradition and who operate very comfortably in the international contemporary art world. And so that kind of bringing the tradition to hearkening back to traditions but updating it to a current set of circumstances is, I think, one of the different circumstances for art here in this region.
And there's also this whole element of dissent through art. And you mentioned Ai Weiwei, he's probably the most well-known artist who has been imprisoned and then became famous because of his political messages and the dissent that he represented. Why do you think this? Why is artistic expression considered dangerous? I mean, is it just China? But I'm sure it's everywhere. A lot of art is considered dangerous. Any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think artists. I think we have to think about artists themselves. I think that artists. I often think of artists as thinking about the world that we live in different ways, and they're often more free to express themselves through their work. If I think of the Chinese situation, actually what was so interesting was the ways that Chinese artists were able to work around the censorship authorities in the post-89 period and how the censorship authorities reacted to their work. So anything such as installation art that they didn't think was art would be censored. Anything that was unknown. And I would just also hesitate at identifying dissent and the reaction of censorship as only being something in this region, because I think that there are acts of self-censorship and in fact censorship in places like the United States and Europe as well. There are sensitivities everywhere we go, and I think that it's wrong to assume that there aren't pressures to bear on.
You're right. In fact, that was my point, that art everywhere, a lot like the written word, is seen as dangerous, especially by authoritarian regimes. So every time there's a movement towards the right, they start feeling vulnerable, and art and literature and sometimes even music is considered dangerous. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's been a recent controversy at the Hirshhorn about the image that you were going to project on the walls of the Hirshhorn. which was about from the
so
70s,
just to set
probably,
some context. So we have this work that the Hirshhorn commissioned 30 years ago, in 1988, and it was a remarkable work. I should have selected an image, but and the artist was at the forefront of new ideas of public art, and so his name is Christoph Wodiczko, and what he did a lot in the late 80s and early 1990s was that he would get slide projections and put them onto buildings, often critical of the building's use. With the Hirshhorn, not so much, although we didn't know at that time what he was planning to project, which I would say would never happen today. We'd want to know what he was projecting on the National Mall, since we're opposite we're basically equidistant from the National Monument and the Capitol. It's a highly prescribed space, highly secure space. And so his image that he created 30 years ago uses the round circular building, the architecture. On one side is a hand holding a gun, and on the other side is a hand holding a candle, as in a candlelight vigil. And then he used our balcony as a political podium, if you like, with a series of microphones. And so, as some of you might know, just last week there was a major act of gun violence in a school. And so, out of respect, we decided to postpone the projection as a way of kind of recognizing the victims. So that was kind of our response to it, because I think to have a monumental projection of a gun on the National Mall, we felt that it could be read as being insensitive. And so we've made efforts now. We'll announce next week the new dates for the projection again.
But you will be going ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that there was a misconception, I think, from at that time when we said that we would postpone it, that we wouldn't stage it again.
Right.
But one of the issues for us is that when you stop something, then you have to start it again. So we had to then go back, and these are the logistical questions that nobody wants to talk about. We had to re-rent the equipment. We had to make sure that the artist was available. So we've been talking to him about new dates, but we'll announce next week.
Yeah. Going back to the idea of tradition and culture, sometimes, as we were looking at your slides, the cultural traditions are not always apparent, but they're always there. Even the portraits, the self-portraits and stuff. Those go back, if I'm not, I may be wrong, but correct me if I am, where they used to do these portraits of ancestors and so on. And they were all portraits of faces. Then there were a lot of images of the Buddha, for example, or Confucius and so on. And so they were always faces that were projected there. Now, in contemporary art, they're putting their own faces there in different ways, and almost reverential. You mentioned the bloodline.
Yes.
That's the same theme with ancestor worship and ancestor art and so on. So they're basically reinventing old traditions and presenting them as new. And the same thing, I think, is happening here with miniature art, with a lot of the contemporary art, with audiovisual art. It's rooted in old traditions, so they're kind of turning it on its head and reinventing it. So that's something that's happening as well. Have you seen it? You're familiar with contemporary Asian art outside of South Asia and China. Any other parts of the world, in Latin America and Africa and so on, similar kinds of movements are taking place?
It's hard to generalize. I think that what we are seeing right now is an interest in returning to traditions in some shape or form. But I think also, if I could maybe think about the situation in the US just for a moment, because I think it's pertinent to this conversation, which is that we've seen, it's really interesting right now, we're seeing develop a very strong sense of identity politic that we saw in the early 1990s. And so with that, you'll see much more of a strong sense of difference, of different cultures, of issues around race being discussed. And I think that is likely to tie in with many of the other kinds of art centres around the world. This is a moment, again, of opening up in a way that we saw just the last 10 years or so be more market-driven. I think now we're actually seeing an openness to new ideas. So I think it's an interesting moment, and I would hope that, when we saw in the late 1990s the whole Biennale circuit open up a whole lot of artists that we would never have been able to see because they got included in these Biennales and Triennales. I'm hoping that we're now going to see that other kind of opening up of artists that don't necessarily engage with the marketplace, that aren't necessarily doing, works that are able to be consumed. Yeah.
Do you have any plans for the Hirshhorn to showcase and expand the scope of kind of art you'll be showing there? Because art has become universal now. It's very difficult to generalize and say that this is Asian or South Asian or East Asian and so on. It's exhibited everywhere.
Yeah. So
do you have any plans at the Hirshhorn to expand it to other regions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this idea of broadening out what we might have called the art historical canon. So the Hirshhorn has a focus on 20th and 21st century art. It's modern contemporary. And I think the real work that we can do right now is to essentially expand the canon, to say, okay, there may have been art centres of London, Paris, New York in the 20th century, but how can we think differently about those artists who are already in our collection and also telling different kinds of stories? So, for example, we've been acquiring work from the Dansukwa movement. This is the Korean monochrome movement in the 1970s, which had a lot of links with the minimal movement in the United States. So we're kind of trying to build out not so much parallel art histories, but interlinked art histories in different ways. We are planning an exhibition of Kishio Suga's work alongside Giuseppe Pennone. So Suga and Pennone, Suga was one of the leaders of the Mono-ha movement in Japan. This was otherwise known as the School of Things, that had a lot of aesthetic similarities with the arte povera movement that Pennone worked within. These were movements in the 1970s, and they were defined by a sense of materiality. And so we will show both those artists as a way of perhaps showing the synchronicity between these two movements, although they were not the same and had very different intentions.
Kusama herself was a precursor to what we know now as pop art and performance art as well. She was a major proponent of performance art. I mean, that's how she started in New York. Some people think that she was the one who inspired people like Warhol and the Warhol Factory and so on. So you've already had that exhibit. Any parallels there that you're going to draw? I mean, was it showcasing? It was a special exhibition, if I'm not mistaken.
It was one of the. Yeah, so when I had always wanted to do this show of her Infinity Mirror Rooms because they had, as works, been largely overlooked. People were really interested in her Infinity Net paintings. And so I went to see her to ask her thoughts about this idea, and then we built out a show that was focused mostly on her Infinity Mirror Rooms, which are these all-immersive installations that you step into. And most of them, it's like being in infinity. So it's dark and all you see are lights out in the distance. It's like you are standing in the cosmos or something like that. So they're very effective, immersive experiences. And, I think the interesting question for us to ask today is, here she is, 88 years old. She was in New York in the 50s. She gained very little recognition. Although she was friends with Donald Judd and many of the other artists, and it said that she had a romantic liaison with Joseph Cornell and others, she really didn't receive the recognition for her work when she was in New York. She moved back to Japan, and I would say it's only been in the last 5 to 10 years, if you're lucky, that people have thought of her as a truly important artist. And I say that because part of when I talked about this art historical process of building out the canon, widening the canon from the way that art history was taught to me, was that Kusama is, at 88, something of an outlier. So even though she's been working since the 1950s, her work was never in sync with any movement. She was not part of the abstract expressionist painters, she was not a minimalist. She sat outside of those movements of groups of artists. She was truly, her individual self. She worked on the idea of infinity through painting, installation, sculpture. And so this idea of a creative individual, I think, is much more in sync with our idea of what an artist or a creative person could be today. And I think that that's partly the real interest in her work today, and also the fact that she creates environments that take you somewhere else. These infinity mirror rooms have been shared ad infinitum on social media. When I asked people why they came to see the show, most of them said that they saw it on social media rather than in the New York Times or the Washington Post as reviewed. So it is this immersive, participatory kind of work also that I think a younger generation, a whole new audience for museums is very interested in. So her exhibition came at an unusual time. If the show, I believe that if we had done that show 10 years ago, it would not have been what it was, which was a huge kind of cultural phenomenon in Washington, and now it's on tour across the US. Yeah.
And talking of which, recently you were at the session earlier with Mohsen Hamid, and I was watching an interview of his on French television, and he was asked that at the end they always ask, which one art show would you recommend people to watch this one year? This was last year.
Yes.
And he mentioned the Kusama.
Oh, he did?
Yes.
Oh, how nice.
So you had at least one major fan.
Ah, very good.
Here. For those of you who are not familiar with who Kusama is a Japanese female artist. She's 88 years old, and when she was in her teens, she basically rebelled against traditional Japanese society, stowed away on a ship, and as a young teenager, and found herself in San Francisco. She knew no one. All she wanted to do was art. She had no idea what kind of art she wanted to do. She was obsessed with this idea of infinity. She hitchhiked away all the way from California, found herself in New York, and started doing performance art on the streets of New York, and basically gained the attention of a lot of people of the Beat generation, and then eventually people like Andy Warhol and Donald Judd and several others of the art movement, who kind of adopted her, and she worked with them for several years in the late 50s and early 60s, and then she just decided to go back to Japan. Today, she lives in Tokyo, but she actually resides in a mental asylum, voluntarily. She says she cannot live with normal people because they don't understand her. And every morning she steps out of the asylum, walks across to her studio, which is across the road from the asylum, works all day, and every evening she goes back to the asylum to go to sleep there. And that's her life. And she's 88 years old, and she's still working today. She's a remarkable character, but like you said, not recognized internationally till about 5 or 10 years ago. And she's had major retrospectives and so on. But she really has been the inspiration for a lot of contemporary art today. So we do one question. We keep talking about contemporary art, and I'm always curious, where these terms come from? I mean, there was modern art, and you say 20th or 21st century modern and contemporary art. When did contemporary art become contemporary? Is it any art of today's? Any art today is contemporary, or is there a movement for contemporary art? And is there a particular kind of art that can be termed contemporary, as opposed to just modern art?
Well,
I mean, all art is modern for its
all art
time.
was contemporary at one point in time.
Precisely, yes.
But I think that we use the terminology to describe, as of now, we use the terminology to describe the post-World War II period. So that would be pop art, all of the abstract expressionism, all of those kinds of movements. But there is new thinking that actually what we should be talking about is 1968 as another break, because that was that kind of social revolution that caused a whole new kind of social thinking and cultural thinking. So I don't think there are any hard and fast terms, but usually we would describe the modern period as late 19th to early 20th century, and then after World War II and beyond as contemporary. Yeah.
And when will contemporary art become old and something else will take over? I mean, we're not quite sure.
Who knows? That's the job of art historians.
Yes. Yeah, but it's also interesting because contemporary art now includes not just painting and sculpture and so on, performance art, video art, film, all kinds of media, and there are several ways in which people express themselves, and some of it is ephemeral. It's just there for a short while and then it disappears. Somebody does a performance art and it's just a one-time thing. And I think somebody records it on video or something, and then that's it.
So I think that the new thinking, so there was a time when the genres or disciplines were more hard and fast, and people really described themselves as a painter or a sculptor or a photographer. I think today artists search for the right medium to express their ideas. So they could at one moment be painting, another moment be doing an installation art or an art piece, or even performance or photography. So we think less in terms of genres because artists think less in terms of genres. But I do think that the ephemeral or the idea is probably primary today. And I say that because we're a collecting institution, so the Hirshhorn collects contemporary art, and we are seeing a shift more towards an idea and less towards the materiality. So, for example, possibly the most challenging work to collect today is performance art. We used to think of performance art as the evidence or the documentation, whether it was the video or the photographs or things like that, that was what you would collect. However, artists today are even doing away with that, and some, such as Tino Segal, have a process by which there is no paperwork, no written evidence of an acquisition, of you buying the work. It's done through oral communication. So when you transfer ownership of the work, you have all the major museum personnel sitting around the table, and it's almost a verbal contract. So there is no evidence that is archived, essentially.
Exactly.
And so I think artists are really helping us to think, pushing the boundaries and helping us to think about ideas in very different ways that I think is truly 21st century. So when we talk a lot at the Hirshhorn about what it means to be a museum of the 21st century. Like, what does that mean? And it certainly means being responsive to artists, but I think more than anything else, we have to have a focus on the idea rather than the object. Because I think that that's truly 21st century thinking. I often use this analogy of the cloud as one that describes that transition from the 20th to the 21st century. So where once we would have stored our files, whether our photographs or paper files, in a filing cabinet in our office, now they're up there in the cloud. Now the weird thing about the cloud is that we don't know who owns it, where it is, what it looks like, how to get it. We don't. And that's actually a huge philosophical leap of faith that I think allows us to think about the 21st century as a tangible, lived, very different experience from the 20th century.
Yeah. Because ephemeral performance art has been there for millennia. I mean, dance or musical performances and whatever.
Although as an accepted medium probably since the 1970s.
Right.
Yeah.
No, but even in ancient times, people would do performance, and nobody kept any records of those except written records
That's
somewhere
right.
saying that somebody had done a particular performance, or poets had performed, or artists, or dancers, and so on. But now, what you're suggesting is that it's gone even beyond that, where we really have no idea how to not just archive it, but how do we transfer it? How do we get a next generation to be able to enjoy what's going on now?
Yes, and that's
Somebody
a
else
challenge
can
for new
control
technology. Artists who create works for the web,
Yeah.
or create works that involve new technology. There's a big debate about how, some artworks that are created in video or new technology only have a particular lifespan.
Yeah.
Right, so, for example, Nam June Paik, one of the pioneers of video art, some museums treat his work and those TVs and videos as if it has a finite life. So it only gets to be shown a certain number of times in its life, and then it will not exist. Other museums have made the decision to what we call migrate the technology, so you upgraded it in order to be able to continue showing it. So there are lots of hard decisions, I think, that museums and others have to make about how we archive the past.
And some art, like Liu Fan, for example, you mentioned South Korea. I mean, it's not just site-specific, but he's not even quite sure what he's going to end up with. He puts a piece of glass on the floor and he drops a rock on it. And that's the art.
Yeah. Yep.
And any design that's formed, he has no control over it.
Yeah, so his whole thing is about chance. How can chance
That's
impact the work?
And it depends on where you drop the rock from, how large the rock is, what it looks like, whether it's round or jagged, etc., etc. So he sort of has some idea of it. And that piece will be just in one space, and you can't move it. When you move it,
then it gets destroyed.
It gets destroyed.
Yeah.
So you've got all these new concepts that artists. They're basically what I'm thinking. What I'm getting at is artists are creating a space in which we view the world differently. And that's what they've been doing always. That's what art has always been about, is to show a mirror to society and say, look at the world in a different way. It's not always what it seems to be. And isn't that what they're doing today, even in contemporary art?
Yes, I think that I often think that the most challenging work, the work that you really kind of hate when you first see it, is often the work that will have the most lasting impact. So it's that work that gives you a visceral kind of reaction.
You should see the world differently.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a few more minutes. I'm not sure if we have time. Maybe we do some question and answers. So we have some mics over there, and maybe the audience can ask Melissa or express their views in any way. Please introduce yourself first, if you may, and then.
Can we look forward, Melisssa, to a show at the Hirshhorn of Pakistani art? Leading question.
Direct.
Very direct, thank you. Well, no, it's a good question, because when I was at Asia Society, we presented a lot of the first-time exhibitions from different parts of the world. And Hanging Fire was actually that first-time exhibition of art from Pakistan, curated by Salim Hashmi. And I think that we've moved beyond those first nation-state shows, because in a way, a lot of them have been done before, and so I think if anything, that next step will be to focus on individual artists or groups of artists within a broader context, given that our mandate is international. So I would be looking to include artists from Pakistan in a kind of broader context than an exhibition devoted solely to artists from Pakistan.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, because I think one of the major functions that art can perform is to bring people together. And we've seen how art has helped eliminate borders in many respects, because a lot of contemporary art is similar across countries and across regions. And I'm not sure if they're being inspired by each other or they're coming up with the ideas independently. The Venice Biennale show in 2015 was the first time that an Indian artist and a Pakistani artist, Shilpa Gupta and Rashid Rana, were in the same space. And I think that was historic. Because this morning Salima was talking to us and she mentioned, Salima Hashmi, that she is going to be curating a show with Akon Gallery in New York, celebrating 70 years of Indian and Pakistan independence, with a show that showcases both Indian and Pakistani contemporary artists. So there is this idea that art brings people together and it breaks down barriers, breaks down borders. So it has a very major role to play. And I think the idea that you had, expanding it and bringing other people, just creates dialogue and opens up everybody's view to other cultures. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes, please.
My name is Mariam. I'm an art historian. I just had a quick question about, despite all the progress and innovation and everything, we still see outdated language and terminology. For example, the use of the word Far East or Near East. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that and what you've done to sort of move away from that and move past that.
I think it depends on where you stand. I haven't heard Far East or Near East in a while. So in fact, in our last session, we heard a lot of talk about the global South. I think that one of the real issues that we are grappling with is terminology. I think that we haven't quite been able to get to what is essentially a new geopolitical kind of landscape. We haven't kind of been able to flesh that out. I think that in our history we kind of respond to other political. We respond to other kind of political scientists and cultural theorists and other kinds of specialists. So I would say that we're not there yet. People have been working on this a while. So let's see. We hope. I mean, right now we're just all kind of dealing with trying to break down nation state, kind of regional designations. So I think that anything that can help us to understand the complexity of it, all the better. It's interesting, when I was doing work on the idea of diaspora, the definition was so much about a Jewish experience. And so I found in a term that one of the Chinese artists, Chen Zhen, had used, which was trans experience. And just by using that term kind of allowed me to open it up a little bit more for Chinese experience. So I think maybe we need to just be more open about the terms that we use that are not even used by other people.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of diaspora, because you specialized in diaspora, Chinese, contemporary art in the Chinese diaspora. There's a very large South Asian diaspora, there's a Jewish diaspora, there's every nation has a diaspora now. And there was a time when the diaspora, or art from the diaspora, was sort of like rejected by, say, in South Asia for sure. A lot of the artists that went to the West or to England or to New York or whatever were kind of shunned by the local art scene because they had left and they had kind of become outcasts or traitors or whatever. And then in recent years, they've been brought back into the scene, and many of them have worked both in Pakistan and with other Pakistani artists or Indian artists and so on. I'm sure the same is true of China. So this whole diaspora thing is also helping break down these barriers. What's a Chinese? I mean, a Chinese is someone who lives in Australia or lives in America or lives in Europe. I mean, you'll find Chinese people everywhere. And I'm sure there are artists among them everywhere. I've spent many years in the Philippines, and there are hundreds of Chinese artists, Filipino Chinese artists over there, hundreds of them. I would say at least every other artist I come across is of Chinese origin. They think of themselves not as Chinese. They have roots there, but they have links with China, and they exhibit in China and back and forth. They exhibit in Singapore or Hong Kong. Same thing with South Asian artists. They're exhibiting in London or in New York, and they're exhibiting back here as well. The diaspora exhibits back here. So these barriers are breaking down.
I think also
but there are still labeling.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the experience of diaspora is changing. I think where once the condition of diaspora was about exile, it was about being cut off from your homeland. You went somewhere else. You may have returned at times, but there was never this back and forth that we have today through communications, through ease of travel. I think that the condition is actually being changed by the ease with which we're able to maintain a bond. That kind of idea of being cut off, you know, and kind of a diasporic culture forming that was more grounded in the 1970s of when they left. I think that was once the case. I actually think it's really evolved in a different way, and I think one of my interests with the Chinese situation was that it was a case study in diaspora, because this was a group of artists who left at almost all exactly the same time, within 5 years, and they settled in Paris, New York, and Sydney. And so to see what their work evolved into, and you had a control group who stayed in China. And so actually what I found was that the types of work that these artists created was defined differently by the history of Chinese people in China with that country. So in France it was refracted often through an idea of exoticism because of the whole Orientalist history and others. So I think that it's very much a case-by-case scenario, and I think it's changing a lot. It's not what it once was. Yeah.
We may have time for just one more question, if there is any, or yes, please. Yeah.
So I have a question regarding.
We can't hear you.
Is the mic on?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So it stems more from a curatorial point of view, and as an art director, how do you think your art, sort of whatever you end up choosing for your gallery, connects with people? Something that comes to mind for me is the 2016 Renwick Wonder exhibit, and how it became more of like an Instagrammable artwork rather than people actually deeply connecting with the art that was present, especially for art installations in that space. So how do you deal with that as a director?
Yeah, so there was a time when contemporary art museums were considered rather elitist, museums with small audiences, and it was really only those who were in the contemporary art world who were interested and visited. I think the big change today is that we have a younger generation, and we call them millennials, who are increasingly interested in experiences. And some museums have responded to that by programming in the selection of their work either installations that are more interactive or participatory, but very much an experience. And so social media has driven a lot of museum attendance and new visitorship. And I think for museums, most museums are very happy to have a younger generation of audiences, because to be quite frank, In the museum director meetings about 5 years ago, I remember distinctly, there was a crisis because everyone was talking about how do you get young people into museums because they weren't that interested, and now that's not the problem at all. I think the issue for most museums is how do you engage them in the right way. We had for the Kusama show many people for whom it was their first ever visit to a museum. And so before they got into the museum, we went through this idea of museum manners. How do you behave in a museum? What are the expectations? Because it's not the same as going to a stadium. It's a very different experience. And so I think that, museums are happy to have new audiences. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that we retain that educational mission, which is essentially about that direct encounter with art. What does the art tell you about, for a modern museum, contemporary art museum, what does it tell you about living in the world today, essentially?
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for Melissa Chiu.
Thank you.